few weeks back just about the questions that we find in the Gospels, in particular, the questions that Jesus asks. The why questions we dealt with early on, but we're also extending it out to all the questions that Jesus asked. And Jesus asked so many questions, and they, like a surgeon, I think, just cuts to the heart of the core of the issue. Do you want to see? Do you want to get well? Why are you so afraid? So often we look at Jesus as the sole source of answers, and he is the answer. But more importantly, he wants us to ask the right questions. So often in a relationship, you and I will find ourselves in an argument, and then we'll wake up and realize that's really not the core issue. It's something else, and unless we're willing to dig deeper. Or if you're part of an organization or a business and you're trying to address a problem, but if you don't know right questions to ask, you'll never find the right answers. That's what Jesus, I think, implores us to do, is begin to ask the hard question, the right questions, trusting that if we ask the right questions, we'll find the right answers. Why are you so afraid? Is a compelling question that cuts to the heart and speaks to our deepest fear. Let us pray. God, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So let's just get this out. Everybody's afraid of something. I don't care if it's heights, public speaking, water, rats, rodents, snakes, you name it. If I asked every one of you, you could begin to think, that's what I'm afraid of. That's my worst nightmare. Please don't put me in the same place. And over again, we just have these deep-seated fears and phobias. And whatever it is in your life, it's shared by a whole bunch of other people. Do you know there are all 550 phobias that are listed? 550 different kinds of things that we're all afraid of. Some of them you already know. It's water, heights, speaking in front of a large group of people, all those kinds of things that people have an innate fear of. Some of them are kind of strange, though. Neophobia is the fear of anything new. Novercaphobia is the fear of your stepmother, which is a very real fear for some. Optophobia is the fear of opening one's eyes. I have three favorites, though. You have to stay with me on this one. Hippopotamonstrosis, quipid, aliophobia. It's the fear of long words. That's insane. If you can say the word, you're cured, right? That word terrifies me, and I just read it. How about this? Homilophobia. It's the fear of sermons. That's just wrong. How about phobophobia, the fear of being afraid? There's an actual fear of being afraid. Some of you remember Y2K. Remember all this? That was very real. If you're of a certain age, you remember the year 2000, panic globally, worldwide. This deep-seated fear that computers were ill-equipped to make the transition to the year 2000. Computers were going to shut down. The banking system was going to shut down. Grid was not going to be working. And people went into full-blown panic mode. They began to sort of hoard things and food and supplies and guns. And this wasn't our best look. I was serving a church at the time, and I remember people coming to me and, we've got room. We've got to start hoarding things and collecting all kinds of supplies because we don't know what's going to happen, and it's going to be chaos. And I could hear the fear in their voice, and I thought to myself, what is it about Jesus tells us not to be afraid? I don't think this is exactly how we're supposed to react in the midst of a crisis. And it just felt like fear kind of brings out the worst in you. A little bit of fear can help you, but too much fear just paralyzes you. It makes you go to places you don't want to go, to do things you don't want to do. And do you remember, if you lived through that period, year 2000 came, calendar, you just feel a countdown and people just bracing themselves for the chaos, the end of the world as they knew it. Do you remember 2000? Remember when it finally clicked over, January 1st? You know what happened? Nothing. But we're afraid. We live by fear. Makes us do those things, speaks to the darker places inside of us. So Mark tells us a little story, and he believes we need to know this story because it's a very important story to the early church, and I think to the church today. And I don't care how many times you've read this. I think it's worth dusting it off and taking a second look and looking for something deeper inside of it, because it's the gospel, the dynamic, breathing, living word of God that speaks to us where we are in what manner we are, and what place we find ourselves in. It's a scary world out there, and we need to hear this story and what Jesus has to say. But read it in context. It's early on in Mark's gospel. And Mark will tell you from the very beginning, when Jesus begins to speak, he begins to attract these large crowds. He begins to perform miracles and healings. And every time he opens his mouth, the crowds get bigger and bigger. And every miraculous thing that he does, people begin to press in on him. I mean, it's almost insane, the idea that they all want to be with him, and they try to control him, and he tries to leave, and they want to make him their king, and he wants no part of being that kind of king. That's not what he was sent for, but it's getting impossible for him to extricate himself from the crowd. They're always pressing in, and every time he does something, they want more and more and more of it. And he realizes he is drained. He's exhausted, tired, depleted, physically, spiritually, emotionally. His tank is empty. So wisely, he tells the disciples, we're going to go to the other side of the lake. And he's exhausted, which explains why he's going to fall asleep, because he has nothing left to give for a while. It's time to rest, to recharge, and replenish what he has. So he decides to take a boat along with his own disciples, cross over the Sea of Galilee, and go to the other side. And suddenly, this massive storm, you know the story, it appears. Wind and turbulence, the waves begin to crash on. They are scared to death. They are seasoned fishermen in some cases. They've been through this before. If you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee, you know it's actually almost built in this sort of wind tunnel so the storm can arise before you even know what's happening. And it comes upon you so quickly, and it can be violent, and it can be over in a heartbeat, but it comes quickly. And these are people who know the sea. They've lived on the sea. They know it, but there's something about this particular storm that scares them to death. They're hanging on for dear life. They're doing everything they can to possibly survive. And they're doing all the things that they want to do and to help become the people they want to. But in this moment, all they can think about is they think this is it. They think about their families and about maybe this is their life is over at this moment. They are in sheer panic. They're terrified. Now contrast that with Jesus, who is asleep. He's asleep in the boat. How can you sleep during a storm? Well, he's exhausted. But as they begin to panic, they're terrified. They wake him up and they say, "Don't you care we're about to go down?" And what does he do? He gets up and he declares to the winds and the waves, "Peace, be still." And order is restored. The waves subside. Calmness returns to the lake. And then he turns to them and asks the question, "Why are you so afraid?" The early church loved this story. In fact, some of the earliest symbolism of the church was a little boat heading straight into a storm. Because that's where they were. They were this little group of people who followed Jesus in the midst of a culture that did not like them and in some cases persecuted them. They were under the oppression of the Roman Empire. They had divisions deeply in their own society and people who ostracized them from worship and community. And it was this little band of people trying to hold on, and their life felt like it was under attack, under siege, and they were just trying to hold it together. Mark's actually a wartime gospel. Just after it, the whole temple's destroyed. The Romans come in and they quell this rebellion that takes place. In doing so, they make a statement and they wipe out as much as they can and disperse anybody who was a part of this rebellion. And so Mark's community realizes, boy, it feels like the world's come crashing down. They're under siege. They're in the midst of the storm. That's why this story means so much to the early church. I think the story is for all of us who live in fear. Jesus says he wants to go to the other side. There's a clue. So what's the other side? The other side is deeper than just the geographical location. It means that other place, the place you don't want to go, the place that's unfamiliar to you, the place that you're afraid of because you don't know what's out there. The other side, you don't know who's there. Maybe there are people you don't want to associate with, you don't want to do it, but Jesus is saying, we're going to the other side. And I have a sense that they're reluctant to do so. Why don't we just stay here? And he says, no, we're going to the other side. And over again, he's going back and forth, and he's making a statement about what's on the other side. So on this side, he'll feed a multitude of people who are clearly Jewish. But then when he goes to the other side, he feeds a multitude of people who are clearly Gentile. He'll help people and do miraculous things on this side, and then when they go to the other side, the Decapolis, the 10 cities, the Hellenistic Greek area, he's going to do miracles, he's going to teach, and he's going to make examples that are unforgettable. What he's saying is this huge divide that we put in our minds and our hearts about this is this side and that's that side, and the two should never, and he's bringing them together to tear down the walls and the barriers that divide all of us. I think there's this constant battle going on between us and Jesus, because Jesus, in whatever form, is always telling us to go to the other side. I don't know of many circumstances when Jesus said, well, let's just stay here and do what you're doing and don't change at all. He's always about bringing us to the other side, whatever the other side must mean for us. And we don't want to do it because we don't like change. And we have this inherent battle saying we're going to do everything we can to stay here, to the degree that we're going to say, Jesus, why don't you just stay here with us? Make us comfortable. This is a good place. I like my life. I don't like change. Just stay here. Don't drag us to the other side. I don't know what's out there. I don't know who's out there. And it's uncomfortable and it's risky and it's scary and I don't want to do it. And so we just have this constant battle. But Jesus always talks about going to the other side. And I think what he's trying to say is if you don't go to the other side in your life, in whatever way that means, you're going to miss something. You're going to deny yourself experiences, things that are important that you'll never see unless you're willing to go to the other side, to be open to something out there that God has in store for you and not to be so afraid. So he takes them to the other side, and the other side is, those are the places we don't want to go. So he takes the disciples to the other side, and if you don't go, you're going to miss it. And I think that's a really important part of the story. You're going to miss what's out there, and I want to show you what's out there so that you'll know and won't be afraid. When I was a kid, they made us read a particular book. I don't know if they still do this. Remember Rip Van Winkle? I got to confess, when I was a kid, I didn't understand that book. I thought it was about a guy who just sat under a tree and fell asleep for 20 years and thought that was a great story. That's not the story. It wasn't until I was an adult that I found out Rip Van Winkle, it's when the American Revolution begins. And he goes and sits under a tree and falls asleep. He misses the American Revolution. He misses the one thing that's going to change the entire world and the future of his own country, and he sleeps through it. That's the story. That's why it's so important. And I think a lot of us just sleepwalk through life. We just go through life and we're numb and we don't see things. We don't want to see things. We just want to be comfortable. We want to stay in our own place and never go to the other side. And what Jesus is saying is, on the other side, there's always another side. If you come to the end of your life, there's another side. And it doesn't mean that it's over. It just means there's something else waiting for you. The other side is always there. Jesus says it. There's something on the other side of your illness. There's something on the other side of the crisis. You can't see it, but there is. There's going to be a day when you look back and you'll think, I'm so glad I stayed with it and made it to the other side to see what I can see and to know what I now know. It's the other side of the relationship. It's the other side of your marriage. It's the other side that you don't know even exists. And Jesus is saying, keep walking by faith with confidence even when you don't know what it is, and see what's waiting for you on the other side. And change is scary. Change is hard. There's nothing worse than being stuck in a place you should not be forever. Second thing is, when you look at this passage, there's something that unless you're a part of this culture, you may not pick up on. It has to do with water. There's a point to this story that Mark puts it there because it happens on the water, and he knows how important water is. You just go back to Genesis, waters of creation, in the desert wilderness, how important water is, the sacrament of water, that it gives life in the midst of death, all those kinds of things. But it also, for the culture, and even in the New Testament, there's this foreboding fear of the water and what's underneath. It's like you're on a lake and you can't see 2 inches beneath you and you're swimming and then something brushes up against your feet and you think to yourself, oh my gosh, it's a shark. And it's in a lake. You know it's not possible, but your fears take you to that place, right? And you don't know what's underneath you, and it terrifies you. And in that culture, the water That's what it represents. All the demonic forces, Leviathan, the great monster in the Old Testament, the beast in Revelation that comes out of the sea. The sea holds everything because it's terrifying. You don't know what's down there. And when Jesus stands and says, "Be still," what he's trying to say is, I have dominion over the demonic forces of this world. Do not be afraid. That I have the power to let that go and to give you your life and peace back. And that group of people who heard it know exactly what it means and how important it is. But also when Jesus stands to say, "Peace, be still," he's talking to the winds and the waves. But if you read it, he's talking to the disciples. I want the winds and the waves to be still, and I want you to be still and to know that I'm here, to give them a sense of calm. And I think on hearing his voice, they felt a sense of peace they had never felt before. I cannot say this enough. God never ever promises that nothing bad's going to happen to every single one of us. God never promises smooth sailing and blue skies. No, there's going to be storms. If you think God promises everything to be easy, then go back and read your Bible, because Jesus will say, you're going to have trials and tribulations. And if you follow me, you're probably going to have more trials and tribulations, because it'll put you at odds with the world. So we know that. We know that God doesn't cause it, but God uses it. We know that God is not the one behind it, but the one who is in the midst of it. He's in the boat with the disciples, sinking, and then he calms the storm. I think what God is promising and what Jesus is saying is when your world begins to crash, when it feels like it's spinning out of control and it's falling apart, then you know that I'm with you. And I don't know about you, but if you have someone with you to love, you can do anything. If you're all alone, it's terrifying. And what Jesus is saying is, you're never alone. I'm with you. And whatever you're facing, the storms of your own life, you're not alone. I want to show you that in a minute, but I want to tell you also, Carly mentioned little kids and what they fear, and any parent in this room will know, gosh, when a child has a nightmare and they scream out to you because they've seen a monster in the closet or they felt something under the bed and they're terrified. I don't know of a single parent who stands in the doorframe and says, look, there's a rational explanation for this. It's reasonable. You did know it. Don't even think about it. Just go back to sleep. No, what you do is you climb in the bed with them and you hold them. And if you hold them tight enough and long enough, they begin to think less about the monster in the closet or the one under the bed, and they think about the one who's holding them, and they begin to calm down, and they feel the sense of reassurance and strength because someone has come when they cried out for help. I want to show you this image on the screen. In 1633, Rembrandt paints a very famous painting, and this is it, taken directly from this story. He begins to look at this story and begin to put it on canvas as best he can. And any person who loves and appreciates art will know that you have to look at the details. And you began to see it not just as, and it's a very vivid painting. And it encapsulates really the violence of the storm and the waves, and the boat looks like it's precarious and it's going to tip over and capsize. And all the fear caught on the face of the disciples. I mean, it's all captured there. And you begin to sort of look at it, and Rembrandt puts in things like toward the back of the boat where Jesus is, there's the light coming from the heavens, and it's dark on the other end of it. And even in the midst of the storm, there's this presence that you begin to sense and feel, that even in the darkness, the light is beginning to appear. And Jesus at the back, and then you can see the individual disciples, and you can see they're holding on by two hands, dear life, and one literally is holding on to his hat on top of his head, and the look of sheer terror in all of them is evident. You could see it, and they just think this might be it, and this is more than they can fathom. They're terrified, and Rembrandt captures that. It's Jesus and his disciples on the boat crossing the Sea of Galilee. We all know this. We all know the story. And then you begin to look. There's Jesus and his disciples. So how many disciples? 12. Jesus, 1. Should be 13, right? And then you begin to think something's wrong. It's odd. Doesn't make sense. Should be 13 disciples in this boat. Count them, and you'll count 14. There's another person in the boat. You have to look closely. He's in the shadows, and he looks terrified. but he's not one of the disciples. So who is it? It's Rembrandt. Rembrandt paints himself into this picture. Jesus invites us into this story to tell us to be still. Do not be afraid. I am with you. You are not alone. Thanks be to God.